stuff will come out of this too. I really do. And as good, as happy as everybody is about the, white community, white America responding, that maybe the African American community will respond to the anti-Semitism within their community, because Drew Brees got blasted for what he did, and there needs to be the same kind of outrage, with the athletes. And now, of course, Nick Cannon, a celebrity who was just filled with anti-Semitic conspiracy stuff. And he lost his job, though. I mean, Viacom fired him, so he's out of his job at VH1 on the VH program he had. But
I haven't heard Fox fire him yet.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know. I don't know if he's been fired.
But as far as I'm concerned, he can go live with Mel Gibson.
He's not. Listen, he's no different. And the reality is
no.
When Mel Gibson did it, he got called out right away. He got marginalized right away. Yeah, you're right. He has not been, as of 7 hours ago, he has not been fired off of The Masked Singer.
Right. I think he's a producer.
Wait. 7 hours ago, he wasn't. 5 hours ago, oh no, he still hasn't.
Yeah, because he's one of the producers of the show.
I know. It was his, according to what he said it was his idea. It was not his idea. It was a Japanese or Korean.
Right, but he brought it to America.
Bring it to America. And yeah, you're right. That might be a tough one, because, he may have some kind of ownership. And I think they were really happy with how that show did. So yeah, it's an interesting dilemma for Fox, because how can Viacom respond? And then I'm just.
But I tell you, companies are gonna pull their advertising if he doesn't get fired.
Yeah. And then wait a second. Yeah, he said, I demand, when he got fired from the Wild and Out show on VH1, this is what Cannon said: I demand full ownership of my $1 billion Wild and Out brand that I created, and they will continue to misuse and destroy without my leadership. He says, I demand that the hate and backdoor bullying cease. And while we're at it, now that the truth is out, I demand the apology. So he wants an apology.
Yeah, I'll give him an apology.
I think Nick Cannon is off his rocker. I really do. I think him and Kanye West might be the most.
Maybe that'll be his running mate, Kanye West running mate.
Might be the most mentally ill celebrities out there. But I think he really is mentally ill. But anyways, you're absolutely right. If he doesn't get fired from Fox, how can they justify that when he was when Viacom came right away and they said, for promoting hateful speech and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. That's what Viacom said. Anyways, folks, I'm troubled by it. I think that it is nothing that I haven't known that's been going on, and I'm hoping that there'll be a real accounting and comeuppance. And again, I'm not saying one is worse than the other. I'm not saying that that anti-Semitism in the African American community is the same as 400 years of slavery. I'm not making any equations between the seriousness of what we're talking about. What I'm talking about is being honest and truthful about racism and prejudice, and to say that it hasn't been going on in the African American community without any type of a punishment or consideration is the issue. So oh, by the way, we didn't even mention Ice Cube, who's been promoting Farrakhan's stuff for years, including in these last few weeks. He's been posting Farrakhan images and quotes for a while. By the way, Farrakhan shared the stage at the Aretha Franklin funeral with Bill Clinton and Al Sharpton and I forget somebody else. And there were people who talked about it then, but nobody ever really dealt with the issue of saying, is this something that we should be, he didn't, I forget what they ended up doing. They didn't have him at the same time, but whatever. I can only tell you that this is a man who's so filled with hate and so filled with anti-Semitism and quite frankly anti-white theories, and how can this be allowed to happen? He's not an entertainer or an athlete or a celebrity. He's a spokesperson and leader in the an acknowledged leader in the African American community. So yeah, it's a serious issue, and it's one that has once again taken the forefront, and hopefully will now be dealt with.
But Farrakhan's been around for years and nothing's been done with him.
Yep. And again, the problem is that there used to be other leadership within the African American community. I mean, Jesse Jackson has receded from view. You don't see it. Al Sharpton became more of a commentator, television personality, and also, by the way, much more because he had a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric when he was first too, and he's become a lot more mainstream and a lot more thoughtful with his approach. But he's not a leader anymore. He's much more of a celebrity, or as a personality. So unfortunately, Farrakhan is one of the religious leaders of the African American community of our in our country. So, anyways, we will. Look at this double portion, which is we're doing another double portion, but I will tell you this double portion is much shorter and is interestingly, even though it's the end of the book of Numbers, is actually not as weighty, or I would say it's not as it doesn't zigzag around as much as some of the other portions that we've been reading the last few weeks. But again, that's why Balak, a few weeks ago, when we read the story of Balaam and Balak, the story of the cursing, that story was really one unit. That was 3 chapters. It was all about the same story. But most of Numbers isn't like that. It's bits and pieces. It's a half a chapter about something, very rarely even a full chapter. We read about the death of Miriam, and that was a chapter. So we're going to we put this up here, and we'll take a look at the text. And it's really the portion begins in a different way than the Christian break is on here. It's just an obvious example that the first verse really does go with the previous chapter, which is why in Judaism, the Jewish tradition, the Torah portion begins with this line: Moses spoke to the heads of the Israelite tribe, saying, "This is what the Lord has commanded." And then it gets into this specific law, which is, again, example of Numbers having some laws and then also some story. If a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath imposing an obligation on himself, he shall not break his pledge. He must carry out all that has crossed his lips. If a woman makes a vow to the Lord or assumes an obligation while still in her father's household by reason of her youth, and her father learns of her vow or her self-imposed obligation and offers no objection, all her vows shall stand, and every self-imposed obligation shall stand. But if her father restrains her on the day he finds out, none of her vows or self-imposed obligations shall stand, and the Lord will forgive her since her father restrained her. If she should marry while her vow or the commitment to which she bound herself is still in force, and her husband learns of it and offers no objection on the day he finds out, her vows shall stand and her self-imposed obligations shall stand. But if her husband restrains her on that day, on the day that he learns it, he thereby annuls her vow, which was in force, or the commitment to which she bound herself, and the Lord will forgive her. The vow of a widow or of a divorced woman, however, whatever she has imposed on herself shall be binding upon her. So too, if while in her husband's household, she makes a vow or imposes an obligation on herself by oath, and her husband learns of it, yet offers no objection, thus failing to restrain her, all her vows shall stand, and her self-imposed obligations shall stand. But if her husband does annul them on the day he finds out, then nothing that has crossed her lips shall stand, whether vows or self-imposed obligations. Her husband has annulled them, and the Lord will forgive her. Every vow and every sworn obligation of self-denial may be upheld by her husband and annulled by her husband. If her husband offers no objection from that day to the next, he has upheld um, all the vows of obligation she has assumed. He has upheld them by offering no objection on the day he found out. But if he annuls them after the day he finds out, he shall bear her guilt. Those are the laws that the Lord enjoined upon Moses between a man and his wife, and as between a father and his daughter while in her father's household by reason of her youth. So that basically, that chapter is about one thing. The chapter of, again, it's not many, it's 16 verses, but as you can see, what this really deals with is vows. And by extent, I mean, it's about women, but by extension, it's really about men. I mean, it starts off, it's about men. It's about all people, which is that if you make a promise, you have to keep it. Now, then the problem is what if a woman makes a vow and she's not in, what role do the men in her life have? Now, it's basically saying if a woman is living with her father and is still young and has, not reached an age of maturity, she's not, then she's not, none of those vows are essentially obligated on her anyways. But if her father allows her to make the vows and doesn't step in, then she has to keep them. Now, all this just basically all makes sense. The only, obviously by our standards, we'd say, well, how can a woman, why is a woman's vows why is there any restriction on it? And that's, of course, because there was still limits to how much power a woman had, in the sense that she didn't have the power to vow things that would, again, affect her family. I mean, some of these things you could make the argument maybe they didn't affect their family, and if it didn't affect her family, or meaning her husband or her kids, then maybe it wasn't maybe it wasn't it wasn't an issue, and it never would have come up. But the issue here is, so let's say a woman says, I'm just going to throw out some possibilities of what they're talking about here. The woman says, for example, that I'm donating 10% of everything that I have to charity. Now, that's a great thing to do, but does she have the right to do that? Would she have the right to do it if she was in her husband's house or in her father's house? And the Torah basically says no, unless they give her permission to do that. So I'm not making there are, I mean, this is still a patriarchal society, and there still are limits on women. There's no question. But in general, it basically is saying that women do have the ability to make vows, take control of their lives to some extent, with permission. And if they're in a situation where they're a widow or divorced, she doesn't have any obligations to anybody else, and she can do it. Look, the reality is that if the same thing was said, that the man had to ask his wife as well for permission, I think everybody here would say, yeah, this kind of makes sense. You're going into an oath, and it makes sense that you have to get your husband or wife's permission, to make the oath. I mean, the problem, of course, is that it's only the women that have to get permission. So I get where people would say, hey, this is not this doesn't seem, there's not equality here. But I do want to point out that within that culture, within those times, this actually does allow a woman to take kind of control of their lives, or allows them to do things that would kind of allow her to do the things that she'd want to do. So Francine asked, what does it mean restrained? it could be translated differently. It could be forbids her. Restrain, I know, sounds a little physical. It doesn't. It's not. It's not. The word doesn't imply physicality. It basically, it's forbidding or blocks her. It could be another less physical idea. But again, this is a law that it's not definitely a feminist law, but there actually are protections here that allow women to do certain things that otherwise people would say, well, does a woman even have I mean, look at it from this angle. You could make the argument that in some cultures, women weren't even allowed to do those kind of things, that people would just completely disallow or have no value for whatever vow the woman had made anyways. They could have just said, well, she doesn't have a right to make a vow. No, she does. Judaism says she does have a right, but she has to kind of defer to her father or to her husband. So it's kind of, it's not completely equal, but it's better than other cultures, even some cultures today. All right. Any questions? Because we're going to move into a whole different set of laws. I laugh when I say laws because it's hard to say that these are laws because they are not. We wouldn't like to think of them as mitzvot. Let's put it that way. But they are. They're here. So let's read them. Oh, by the way, I also want to say one other thing. The previous portion, the previous chapter, really is indicative of how important vows and obligations are in Judaism. And we are going to, of course, think about them at Kol Nidre. When we say the Kol Nidre prayer, we say all vows, all promises. We don't think too much about what that meant for our ancestors because, generally speaking, we don't make those kind of vows. I mean, some of us might, but most of us don't make the kind of vows that people used to make. We don't generally make those kind of vows, and we're not really held accountable for our vows and promises anymore. So we live in a culture that's much more forgiving and in some cases, quite frankly, completely oblivious to promises that people make. So that being said, let's look at the next chapter. Chapter 31, which is a new idea. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the Israelite people on the Midianites, then you shall be gathered to your kin. We'll read a little bit more. We'll read this section and then we'll come back and talk about it. Moses spoke to the people saying, let men be picked out from among you for our campaign, and let them fall upon Midian to wreak the Lord's vengeance on Midian. You shall dispatch on the campaign 1,000 from every one of the tribes of Israel. So 1,000 from each tribe were furnished from the divisions of Israel, 12,000 picked for the campaign. Moses dispatched them on the campaign, 1,000 from each tribe, with Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, serving as priest on the campaign, equipped with the sacred utensils and the trumpets for sounding blasts. So these are not shofarot, these are chatzetzrot. These are metal horns. That's why they translated it as trumpets. They took the field against Midian, as the Lord had commanded Moses, and they slew every male. Along with their other victims, they slew the kings of Midian, Avi, Rechem. I'm trying to read it in Hebrew as we do this. Tsur, Hur, Reva, the 5 kings of Midian. And they also put Balaam, the son of Beor, to sword. The Israelites took the women and the children of the Midianites captive and seized as booty all their beasts, all their herds, and all their wealth. And they destroyed by fire all the towns in which they were settled and their encampments. They gathered all the spoil in their booty, man and beast. And they brought the captives, the booty, the spoil to Moses, Eleazar, the priest, and the whole Israelite community at the camp in the steppes of Moab at Jordan, near Jericho. Moses, Eleazar, the priest, and all the chieftains came out to meet them outside the camp. Moses became angry with the commanders of the army, the officers of thousands and the officers of hundreds who had come back from the military campaign. Moses said to them, "You spared every female. Yet they are the very ones who at the bidding of Balaam induced the Israelites to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor, so that the Lord's community was struck by plague. Now therefore, slay every male among the children, and also slay every woman who is known man carnally. But spare every young woman who has not had carnal relations with a man. You shall then stay outside the camp 7 days." All right, we'll read another couple verses and we'll come back. Everyone among you who are among your captives who has slain a person or touched a corpse shall cleanse himself on the 3rd and 7th days. You shall also cleanse every cloth, every article of skin, everything made of goat's hair, and every object of wood. Eleazar the priest said to the troops who had taken part in the fighting, "This is the ritual that the Lord has joined upon Moses. Gold and silver, copper, iron, and tin and lead, any article that can withstand fire. These you shall pass through fire, and they shall be clean, except that they must be cleansed with water of lustration, and anything that cannot withstand the fire, you must pass through water. On the 7th day you shall wash your clothes and be clean, and after that you may enter the camp." Let's stop right here, and then we'll continue on. So this is tough to read because Moses, well, let's talk about the Midianites for a quick second to remind people of who the Midianites are historically, who these people are. First of all, they're descendants of Abraham. So they're not Israelites, but they're related. They're like the Ishmaelites, who are also children of Abraham. They are related. They're not related through Isaac, and they're not related through Jacob, the next one. Because like the Edomites are descendants of Isaac, but they're not descendants of Jacob. So the closer off you branch off, the closer you are to us. So these are like second cousins. We don't know exactly how the Midianites lived. We don't really have archaeological evidence about what their lives were like or how they lived. What we know about them is what the Bible tells us. And what we know about the Midianites is that they are not normal. They don't live like the other kingdoms or the other groups. They don't definitely live like Egyptians. They definitely don't live like the Babylonians, and they don't live like Canaanites or Philistines. They seem to live more like nomads. They seem to be like Bedouin people, and they seem to live in different areas, which is why it says that they lived in towns and cities, but they also lived in encampments. And it could be that, like Abraham, they were nomads, many of them, and then some of them settled in cities, like Abraham's people, like us. That we had a nomadic ancestry, but we also then started settling in cities. So that's some of what we know about the Midianites. And that there wasn't, and this isn't, when they're wiped out here, this isn't the end of them. There are other Midianite groups that survive and that continued in some cases to be a thorn in the side of Israel. What else do we know about them? Well, what we know about them from Exodus on, from the story of Moses on, is that Moses was married to a Midianite woman. Zipporah is a Midianite. Jethro is a Midianite. He's a priest of Midian. We don't know what that would have meant, but he's definitely at least a religious leader, if not a political leader of Midian. So Moses is to some extent wiping out his own family. That's Moses' connection to these people. So we have Abraham's connection to the Midianites. Now you have Moses' connections to the Midianites. So Moses' kids, he has two sons, Gershom and Eliezer. Gershom and Eliezer are half Midianite. And Moses just had to, I mean, it was God. God said it and he repeated it. But Moses, as you just read, makes sure that the law is carried out to the nth degree, that even the women, at least the women who had known men, are killed. So Moses is wiping out his own family, or his own kid's family. So this is a really, really, I mean, when you consider the whole context of this, that's a pretty heavy duty thing to have to deal with. The fact that Midianites are in his family, by the way, might explain why Moses' family isn't held in the same regard that Aaron's family is, or that some of the other people, Joshua's family, or maybe some of the other tribal leaders who were good tribal leaders, or good, there weren't many of them that were good, but, you know, one of the reasons why Moses' family is also kind of not looked on very well is because maybe, again, because they're part Midianite. So keep that in mind with Moses. But let's then talk about the last thing about the Midianites, which is we just read that after Balaam doesn't curse the Israelites, the story ends, the chapter ends with the Israelites engaging in an orgy and in a worship of the god of Peor, Baal Peor, with Midianite women. That Midianite women are brought in somehow to lead the men astray, which is why Moses tells them to kill the women. He says, you killed the men, but the men actually weren't the problem. It was the women who got you to worship these gods that are the problem. So you got to kill the women, which again then begs the question, Moses, you're married to, or you were married to a Midianite woman. And again, everything we know about Zipporah is that she's a very good woman, but just now Moses' command is kill the women that are like my wife. But again, in the context of the story that we just read a couple chapters ago, the Midianite women were the source of the problem. So what's interesting about this is that we're reminded of it because Balaam himself is killed. So this guy who kind of winds up being a hero, an unlikely hero, by blessing us, winds up being killed. So his end is not a good one. There's no happy ending for Balaam. Balaam doesn't get to go off into the sunset after pulling off this reversal. No, he gets killed by the Israelites. The very Israelites that he blessed end up killing him. They end up killing him. He doesn't die by accident. He doesn't get caught up in it. It says they killed him. They took him out and killed him. So they kill the kings that they have, the Midianite leaders, and they kill the prophet Balaam. They burn the towns, take the women captive. And the only thing that survives from the people are the unmarried girls, the unmarried women. And then they get to keep the booty, the spoil. Now that's interesting, by the way, too, because sometimes the booty or the spoil was completely destroyed. That the Israelites were told in some cases not to keep anything, that nothing could be kept, that everything had to be destroyed. So this is a little different. And now we've gotten into these laws of the fact that because they've now come into contact with death, and this isn't like somebody died, you killed them, you massacred them. Now they've got blood, and now they've got to wash off, and they have to go through purification. So it's a vengeance. It's definitely an act of vengeance. It is the end of the Balaam story, if you will. It's the final word in the Balaam story. But also think about what happens here with women in this story. We read about women's vows. Now we've read about women being killed because of their use of their bodies and their beauty, whatever, for idolatry. And keep in mind, this won't be the last thing about the women in this portion, a double portion, if you will. So again, thinking about the Midianite women, thinking for a moment that they survived, even as they had just witnessed their husbands and fathers being killed. That no, they're getting killed too. Any comments? Well, let's finish up the story. And Lord said to Moses, "You and Eleazar the priest." And again, this is Aaron's son, right? Because Aaron died. And the family and the heads of the community take an inventory of the booty that was captured, man and beast, and divide the booty equally between the combatants who engaged in the campaign and the rest of the community. You shall exact a levy for the Lord. In the case of the warriors who engaged in the campaign, 1 item in 500 of persons, oxen, and sheep shall be taken from their share and given to Eleazar the priest as a contribution to the Lord. And from the half share of the other Israelites, you shall withhold 1 in every 50 human beings, as well as cattle, asses, and sheep, all the animals, and give them to the Levites who attend to the duties of the Lord's tabernacle. And Moses and Eleazar, the priest, did as the Lord had commanded Moses. The amount of booty, other than the spoil that the troops had plundered, so the troops get to keep a bigger share, obviously, twice as big a share. And it says, other than what the troops had kept, came to 675,000 sheep. I mean, it's a lot of sheep. It's basically a sheep for every adult male. 72,000 head of cattle. I mean, it's more than one sheep. 61,000 asses, and a total of 32,000 human beings, namely the women who had not had carnal relations. Thus, the half share of those who engaged in the campaign was as follows: the number of sheep, 337,500. And from the Lord's levy, the sheep was 675. The cattle came to 36,000, from which the Lord's levy was 72. The asses came to 30,500, from which the Lord's levy was 61. And the human beings was 16,000, from which the Lord's levy was 32. Moses gave the contributions levied for the Lord to Eleazar the priest, as the Lord had commanded Moses. As for the half share of the other Israelites, which Moses had withdrew from the men who had taken the field, that half a share of the community consisted of 337,000 sheep, 36,000 head of cattle, 30,000 asses, and 16,000 human beings. From this, the half share of the Israelites, Moses withhold 1 in every 50 humans and animals, and he gave them to the Levites who had attended to the duties of the Lord's tabernacle, as the Lord had commanded Moses. The commanders of the troop divisions, the officers of thousands, and the officers of hundreds approached Moses. They said to Moses, "Your servants have made a check of the warriors in our charge, and not one of us is missing. So we have brought as an offering to the Lord such articles of gold as each of us has come upon: armlets, bracelets, signet rings, earrings, and pendants, that expiation be made for our persons before the Lord." And Moses and Eleazar accepted the gold from them, all kinds of wrought articles. All the gold that was offered by the officers and of thousands and the officers of hundreds as a contribution came to 16,750 shekels, which is a huge amount. That's a huge amount of stuff. And again, the Levites got stuff from the congregation. Eleazar got stuff from the warriors, and he obviously is not. There's not as many. I mean, it's him and his family. It's the Kohanim really, and it's not the Levites. The Levites are bigger and have more people, but he gets a pretty decent sum, right? But in the ranks, everyone kept his booty for himself. So Moses and Eleazar the priests accepted the gold from the officers of thousands and the officers of hundreds and brought it to the tent of meeting before the Lord. So this is again, it's a lot of math. I don't know, Harvey, were you did you go through the accounting of this? I don't know. Where's Harvey? Are you there?
I'm here. No, I'm here.
Yeah, so you can see there was. I'm going to show it to you because I want you to. I'm going to show you the table on this so that you can. So that everybody can see this. So there's the breakdown for people who want to see a visual explanation of the Midianite campaign. That's the breakdown, a table breakdown of how the spoils were divided. So this is, if we were just reading Matot by itself, we would be coming to the end of Matot. We have one more chapter. So we had a chapter about women making vows, essentially. We had a chapter of the Midianite campaign. And now we have a chapter that's completely different, as Monty Python would say. And now for something completely different. There's no real necessarily a connection between the things you're about to read. But I mean, there is and there isn't. There isn't an obvious, it's not a narrative that needed the previous chapter necessarily, but it kind of makes sense maybe in some ways why these things happened after they did. Any comments or questions about the Midianite campaign? Anybody want to say anything about it or have any?
Yes, I do.
Please.
I'm comparing this to the slaughter of between 6,000 and 8,000 Jewish men by Muhammad. And there was one woman who was so bitter about the treatment of her family members, her men who she saw slaughtered, that she poisoned Muhammad. Now, I'm wondering.
Well, by the way, that's a Muslim legend. It's not in the Quran, obviously, but
okay.
It's an established tradition, and it's a midrash. I would say it's their equivalent of a midrash. So yes, there are stories about it. But finish up, Marina, with
yes. Well, I mean, there must have been people who were very bitter after losing their family members, and I mean, how do you keep them from doing sneaky, nasty things and poisoning you if they're your booty?
Yeah, one would have to say, how do people make sense of the only thing I would say about the comparison between those stories is, you could make the argument that that's one of the reasons why the women who are married couldn't stay alive, right? But again, what if you were an unmarried virgin 14-year-old girl who gets to survive? So your point is yeah, wouldn't that person maybe want to one day poison the Israelite husband that they got married off to? Now remember something. We're going to read it in Deuteronomy, in the next book of the Bible, in Devarim. You will read a law in the Torah, in Kitetze, that specifically says if you take a woman in battle and you have sex with her, she is your wife. She is not your slave. She's not your concubine. You can't just send her away. You can't sell her into slavery. She is now your wife and has to be treated as a wife. So I want to make that point. But building on what Marina said, what if you were that woman? How would you ever come to terms with your new family, if you will? It's an interesting point. I mean, it's hard for us to put our own kind of sense to this for what would a young woman, how would a young woman deal with this? I will say this, Marina, you don't have to go back 1,400 years to Islam's story. You can go to, unfortunately, some of the wars that have been fought in the last 3 or 4 years in Syria, where women were taken captive by ISIS and forced into marriage or sexual slavery by the commanders there. And what happened to them, whether they were Kurds or Yazidis? What did they do when they were taken captive? And we have some of their testimonies. I mean, these women are alive, walking around. They speak at places. They're on video. You can see their testimony. So this does happen today. Again, thankfully, we live in a much different world where we would think about what their lives would be like. But for so much of human history, this was for us to read this now and to be appalled by it, that's natural.
It was normal in those times.
Was normal, and it was, unfortunately, probably again, if you were not a married woman. The story in Muhammad's story is a married woman. um, in the case of a young woman who's now going to be married off to an Israelite, it could be that her life was starting over, a new chapter, and it was hard for her not to kind of adjust to the new life, and that, she'd have kids and they'd be Israelite kids, and that was part of her story. Listen, Marina, it's a good point. I mean, thank you for making us think about it for a second, at least, to maybe take a moment to envision what a Midianite girl's life was like 3,200 years ago. But here's another thing to consider, Marina. Those women, those young women, are our mothers now too.
I have a question.
Yeah.
My question is, I really don't understand what I could get out of this Porsche. I mean, the ones prior to this, no problem, but I don't see what I could get out of this. It's like a combat battle order, and
Yeah.
being an ex-military, I can understand that, but I don't understand what personally I can get out of this.
Look, there are parts of the Torah that are problematic, which is why I kind of, start get, I start getting like, this is a tough part. Look, you could make the argument that we have, when we get into the beginning of the chapter, and whenever we get into like kind of the census taking, the numbers, that it's tough. It's tougher to get to derive meaning from it. People do. I mean, there's people who look at the numbers, who count up the sheep and these things and look for mystical formulations in it. I'd say that's one of the few things that people will do, is say, hey, maybe this represents something else. If you add up these letters, these numbers, it adds up to this. I mean, there's people who do that, but I mean, you're right. It's hard to get inspiration from it. It's hard to take away something from this. I mean, I think the one thing that I would say is that from the Midianite campaign is that Moses, this is why I gave you the backstory or reminded people of the Midianites, that Moses is in this position of having to wage war against his own family, and family by marriage, and a family that had treated him so well, that took him in after he left Egypt. To me, that's an example of tremendous self-sacrifice, or at least putting aside your own emotion to do something like this. And you think about the kinds of things that people have had to do. I look, it's not my issue, in the sense that it wasn't for me. I'll give you an example as somebody who understands combat and understand. Look, we didn't send Japanese Americans into combat in Japan because we were worried that they would defect, or it would be too hard for them to go to war against their own people. Of course, it turned out that, when they were in Europe, they were the highest decorated per capita, 442nd. We know how heroic they were, but that was the reason. Now, the argument that people made is that nobody ever said, we're not going to send German Americans into combat in Germany, or Italian Americans into combat in Italy. And there were Italian Americans. I mean, you can watch The Godfather, you can watch, there are fictionalized stories of this, but these were real stories of Italian Americans who, because they spoke Italian, when they went into Italy, they could speak to the Italian soldiers and communicate with them and get information from them and bond with them. But it must have been hard for some Italians to again, they were primarily, a lot of Italian campaign, they were fighting Germans, but if they were fighting Italians, they were killing other Italians. And all the German Americans, I don't mean the German Jewish Americans like Francine's dad, who's on the, who was Austrian, who's, Francine's on the line right now. I always talk about how Francine's dad, because he spoke German, was able to interrogate the German officers that they captured in the Alpine campaign, because he went through the Alps. But but he was there for, to some extent he was there, that was vengeance for him. But what about a German American whose family came from Germany a generation or two before, that are now killing Nazis, that are killing, in some cases, German kids by the end of the war, by the time the Americans got there, how hard was it for, I don't know. I don't know how hard it was for a German American to kill a German kid who was, again, conscripted as a teenager. May not have been the most passionate Nazi because, he really didn't have a choice, and he was a kid, and his dad had just been killed, and uncle has just been killed, and now he's about to be killed. How hard was it for German Americans to do that? So I don't know. I mean, that, to me, that's the story I take away from it. I take away from it is Moses's, the feeling that Moses had. That's my takeaway, if you will. I'll take away that image of what was it like for Moses to hear that, Cam? Like my midrash here would be, did Moses argue with God for a second and say, hey, wait a second, God, this is my family. These are my kids. These are their cousins. Do we really have to kill everybody? Maybe was that part of the discussion? And then when he sees these people being brought forward, and then he steps up and says, yeah, but we got to kill the women. That's where you go, oh, wait, Moses is not going to hesitate in this. Moses is going to do this and takes it to the next degree. So,
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Yeah, about that. My late father was in Army intelligence in the Pacific in World War II. I guess Army intelligence is an oxymoron, but there were a few Japanese Americans in the Pacific in the U.S. military. My father actually worked with one. He told me the story. That was very dangerous because the fear was that the native population who had been victimized by the Japanese would not be able to make the distinction, and that the Japanese Americans, their lives would be at risk in the Philippines. And in fact, the man he worked with, my father said the only time he had to raise his gun and fire it in the air was in defense of a Japanese American who was in the U.S. Army in military intelligence. That was one of the fears that the military had, that they could not protect Japanese Americans from the local population in the Pacific.
That's interesting. Well, listen, we don't want to talk about Japanese. We could go down a hole talking about Japanese war crimes against the Chinese and Koreans and in the Philippines and in Southeast Asia. I mean, it was horrific. It was interesting. Just like 2 nights ago, I finally watched Midway. I never seen it, and it was good. I mean, it was a solid movie. I wasn't the greatest war movie of all time, but I thought it was a solid movie. And they did deal a little bit, obviously, with military intelligence, how important it was in the Battle of Midway. But what was interesting about it too was it really wasn't part of the story, but they made sure it was part of the story, was how many Chinese were killed by the Japanese in retaliation for the Doolittle raid. But what was so interesting about that was when you wonder, like, that really wasn't what that was about, and Midway wasn't really about the Doolittle raid. If you saw who financed the movie, it was financed by the Chinese. The Chinese producers, literally. I was sitting there, and at the end, they had a Chinese guy being tortured and killed, and it said 250,000 Chinese were killed. That was literally producers. We want to give you a little something back. So I want to tell you again, I'm not saying that the Japanese shouldn't be held accountable for war crimes, and we should all remember, they killed maybe 20 million Chinese and maybe more. It was horrible. But I found it really interesting that was an example of the financing, because you never would have seen that 20 years ago in an American war movie where we talked about Chinese victims. But it's good it's good that it's being brought out. I mean, I just thought it was ironic and kind of humorous that if you watch the very beginning of the movie with the Chinese production company, that's why I was there. So
I saw that movie as well this past week, and I saw the same thing. I went, why is a movie about Midway have the Doolittle raid in it? It didn't really make sense. And then I saw, oh, I see who financed this movie. I get it.
Yeah, it was really throwing them a bone.
Harry,
That's the world we live in, man. That's the world we live in. What?
And I was saying it has to do with the Navy because they launched from a carrier.
No, they really stretched it though. They really stretched it because they were like, well, this really isn't. And then that was it. I mean, like, you can't talk about, you mentioned the Doolittle raid like it happened one time and then there was no other, thing about the flying tiger. I mean, that's a whole nother story. Somebody should make that movie, Chenault and the fighting the flying tiger. That was a great story, but it wasn't that story. And it was just, let's add that. Look, I mean, to some extent, it's interesting because that's the Midianites being brought into this story and being with the background of Moses is really what the takeaway for me is in this, which is that Moses, before he dies, I mean, he's basically told, you're going to die. And one of the last things you're going to do before you die is you're going to go to war against the Midianites. And to me, that's like the takeaway from this is that this is Moses kind of having to come to terms with like business, and the business of what this must have meant for his family. I mean, we don't know that Zipporah is still alive by this point, but what did Zipporah say while this was going on, while she's watching Midianites Midianite women being killed in front of her? Anyways, it is not, again, where I thought, it's not necessarily what we're going to talk about today, but it's there and we talked about it. So we're going to read the last few chapters in this double portion. This portion, this chapter 32 is still part of Matot by itself when it's read by itself. But let's look at it. And again, this is not directly connected to what came before, but it's also a little bit about war. So it says the Reubenites, the Gadites owned cattle in very great numbers. Well, maybe because they just won a big battle and had a lot, but so did everybody else, right? Noting that the lands of Jezer and Gilad were a region suitable for cattle, the Gadites and the Reubenites came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and you can see that Eleazar is now working with Moses all the time now. This wasn't a one-time thing in the previous chapter. Eleazar is now taking Aaron's place. He's taken his father's place and is now, they're consulting with, with Moses as a leader. And they said, the Gadites and Reubenites came to Moses, Eleazar, and they said, Atarot, Dibon, Yazer, Nimrah, Cheshbon, Ale, Sebam, Nebo, Beon, the land that the Lord has conquered for the community of Israel is cattle country, and your servants have cattle. It would be a favor to us, they continued, if this land were given to your servants as a holding. Do not move us across the Jordan. So why is this in this portion? This chapter now is telling us something very important about how the Reubenites and Gadites and these tribes do not want to go across the land into the land of Israel. They say, you know what, we're good here. These are really great places for our cattle. Let us stay here on the other side of the Jordan River in what's modern day Jordan and Syria. Let us stay here. We conquered this land from Sihon and Og, which we read about in the last portions. We read about this battle. We wound up with this land that was not Canaanite land. We wound up with it because they went to war against us. They went to war against us. We conquered them. We took their stuff. We took their land. And it's going to come back up later. We read about it later that the Ammonites say, that's our land. It's on our side of the Jordan River. That's our place. And we say to them, what are you talking about? We didn't take it from you. We took it from Sihon and Og, Amorite kings, Canaanite kings, if you will. So it's our land. So here the Reubenites and the Gadites say, let us stay here. Now, of course, we're going to read much later on, these two tribes, they get their wish, folks. They get to stay there. And in return for their not wanting to be with the rest of Israel, they're the first two tribes that disappear. We know about the 10 lost tribes. The first two of those 10 tribes that disappear are these two, the Reubenites and Gadites. And we'll read the half of the tribe of Manasseh that decides to stay on the east side of the Jordan. So let's see what happens. They ask for it. Moses replies to them, are your brothers to go to war while you stay here? So his response to them first, and again, this theme of the military, really? You're gonna sit out the war that we have to fight now for our land, and you're gonna take this land. why will you turn the minds of the Israelites from crossing into the land that the Lord has given them? Right? You're going to inspire other people to not want to go any further. That is what your fathers did when I sent them to Kadesh Barnea to survey the land. And he's reminding them of the 10 scouts that came back with a bad report and messed everything up for the last 40 years. After going up to the Wadi Eshkol and surveying the land, they turned the mind of the Israelites from invading the land that the Lord had given them. Thereupon the Lord was incensed, and he swore, none of the men from 20 years up who came out of Egypt, these people shall not see the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they did not remain loyal to me. They didn't remain loyal to themselves. They didn't believe in themselves. None except for Caleb, the son of Yefuneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, the son of Nun, for they remain loyal to the Lord. And again, this is Caleb from the tribe of Judah and Joshua from the tribe of Ephraim. And Joshua, who we know is going to be, as we read last week, the next political leader of the people. The Lord was incensed at Israel, and for 40 years he made them wander in the wilderness until the whole generation that had provoked the Lord's displeasure was gone. And now you, breed of sinful men, have replaced your fathers to add still further to the Lord's wrath against Israel. So he tells them, you're no better than your dads. You have the same lack of faith. You have the same laziness of spirit and of energy. You're going to say, this is good enough for me to stay here? So he tells them, you're no better than your dad. If you turn away from him and he abandons them once more in the wilderness, you will bring calamity upon all the people. Then they stepped up and said to Moses, we will build here sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children, and we will hasten as shock troops in the van of the Israelites. And again, this is not a minivan, this is military van, until we have established them in their home, while our children stay in the fortified towns because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the Israelites is in possession of his portion, but we will not have a share with them in the territory beyond the Jordan, for we have received our share here on the east side of the Jordan. So, what they say, right? We'll go in and fight. We'll fight. Let our family stay here. We won't take any part of the land of Israel. That's it for everybody else. The other tribes can settle there. We'll settle here. And by extension, by the way, that means everybody else gets more land. All the other tribes, those two and a half portions, they're going to get more land. So, we'll keep this. We won't take any portion in another place. Let us stay here. And by the way, notice what they say, though. Let our kids stay here. So it's interesting because they're trying to protect their families from the fight, which the rest of the people don't get to do. The rest of the people don't get to protect their families. The rest of the people everybody is out in the open. They're fighting. Anybody can get hurt. So they're being a little selfish with their own families, obviously, because they're saying the army will go in, but not the civilians. Okay, but it gets a little bit more complicated because look at what they had said. We will build here sheepfolds for our flocks and towns for our children. Notice the order of what their priorities were. Notice what their priorities were, their possessions. And now look what Moses says to them. If you do this, if you go to battle as shock troops at the instance of the Lord, and every shock fighter among you crosses the Jordan at the instance of the Lord, right? This isn't my idea. God told us we have to do this. Until he has dispossessed his enemies before him, and the land has been subdued at the instance of the Lord, and then you return, you shall be clear before the Lord and before Israel. And this land shall be your holding under the Lord. So I'll do this. If you send your soldiers over, every one of them, every single one of them, I'll do that deal for you. But he says, but if you do not do so, you will sin against the Lord and know that your sin will overtake you. And then look what Moses says to them. Build towns for your children and sheepfolds for your flocks. But do what you have promised. So notice what Moses did. He reversed it. Build cities for your kids first, then worry about your sheep. Get your priorities right. Your priorities are your family, not your possessions. So it tells you that these tribes needed to learn still something about what your priorities should be. Now, it's obviously a great lesson for us, you know. What are our priorities? In that little reversal is a Devar Torah, is a lesson. There are people who could do a lesson, do a whole sermon just on that, the reversal that happens in the Torah. That's why we pay attention to every word and how everything's laid out, because you get these beautiful flips of language where God will say something based on what the person said. And here Moses has done it. Anybody else going to add anything besides the dog? I'm just kidding, friends. No, this is Moses's clever answer to the people of what they should do. So,
Charlie, where are you guys? Come in here. Be quiet. Come in here and be quiet.
So, it's not working. Well, you're not on mute, Francis. We can hear you. Okay? Just want to. No, yeah, you're not muted, so don't worry about it. I mean, I just want you to know. So let's read what happens. The Gadites and the Reubenites answered Moses, "Your servants will do as my Lord commands." He doesn't say, of course, as God, because this is really Moses' compromise. "Our children, our wives, our flocks, and all our livestock will stay behind in the towns of Gilad," which again is in the northern part of their territory, in the land today, which is the Golan Heights. "While your servants, all those recruited for war, cross over at the instance of the Lord to engage in battle as my Lord orders." Which, by the way, this tells us that the land of Gilad, which again is in the Golan, was part of Israel before the Israelites even came into Israel. That this land came into our possession with the war against Sihon and Og. That this is our territory even before. Now again, it's not part of the promised land, but it's part of the territory of Israel. And it is part of the territory of Israel during the time of King David and Solomon and the kings who come after in the north of Israel. And it was part of Judea, the kingdom of Judea, during the time of King Herod. It was part of the territory that he controlled. So in Herod's map of Israel, if you will, in Herod's map, the Golan, which is called Ituria, is part of the Jewish land. Okay, so if you will, Judea, as it was called at the time, which, by the way, would have been one of the names of the modern nation of Israel. Israel might have been called Judea, but we went for the other biblical name, which was Israel, the land of Israel, which of course goes to Eretz Yisrael. Little geography lesson. I was going to put up the map, but it's okay. "While your servants, all those recruited for war, cross over the instance of the Lord to engage in battle as my Lord orders." Then Moses gave instructions concerning them to Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the family heads of the tribes. He said to them, and of course, why is he saying it to them? Because he knows he's going to die soon. And he wants them to, the next generation, to know, this is the deal that I made. Make sure we enforce this, okay? Moses said to them, "If every shock fighter from among the Gadites and the Reubenites crosses the Jordan with you to do battle at the instance of the Lord, and the land is subdued before you, you shall give them the land of Gilad as a holding. But if they do not cross over with the shock troops, they shall receive holdings among you in the land of Canaan." So he doesn't actually say they get nothing. That wouldn't really make sense. He says, look, if this doesn't work out, they have to live with us. They're our people still. The Gadites and the Reubenites said in reply, whatever the Lord has spoken concerning your servants, that we will do. We ourselves will cross over shock troops at the instance of the Lord into the land of Canaan, and we shall keep our hereditary holding across the Jordan. So Moses assigned to them the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph, the kingdom of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the kingdom of King Og of Bashan, the land with its various cities and the territories of their surrounding towns. So it doesn't say this is Ammonite territory or any other, the Aram, the kingdom of Syria. He says this is Judean territory. So this is, this is the territory. So Jews have a long history in the land of the Golan, and here it tells us exactly the places that they built up. The Gadites rebuilt Dibon, Atarot, Aroer, Atarot, Shofan, Yazer, Yogbeha, Beth Nimrah, Bet Haran, as well as the fortified towns or as enclosures for their flocks. The Reubenites rebuilt Heshbon, El Ale, Kiratayim, Nebo, Baal Meon, which is further south, some names being changed, and Sibma. They gave their own names to the towns that they rebuilt. The descendants of Machir, the son of Manasseh, went to Gilad and captured it, which is further north, dispossessing the Amorites who were there. So Moses gave Gilad to Machir, the son of Manasseh, and he settled there. Yair, the son of Manasseh, went and captured their villages, which he renamed Chavot Yair, which is the villages, this area of Yair, who is Manasseh's son. And Noba went and captured Kenat and its dependencies, renaming it Noba after himself. So this is how the Golan winds up amongst our territories before we even had it. And I will, by the way, since we have it up, I will show you, if I can, well, maybe, no. I was going to say if it was easy, I can't find my browser history. I can't find the map. But anyways, I mean, it's easy to see. Actually, you know what I could do? I can share. I'll share this map, everybody. Let me share this map to show you. This is the modern map of Israel. This is our map of Israel where we're talking about in this territory. Whoa. This is this area from, it's a substantial part of the other side of the Jordan. So from here all the way down to here, all of this area, which is now part of Jordan, the country of Jordan would have been part of now Israel. And it was, as I said, during King Herod's reign. So let's go back.
Did the Romans force him out? Is that why it's not?
No, the Romans didn't force Herod out. They actually let him reassert Judean territory. What happened is that when Herod died, each of his 4 sons inherited different parts of it. So the son who inherited the north was not one of his stronger sons. None of his sons were really that strong. He kind of kept him that way. He kept them fighting amongst each other too. You know, King Herod was so insane that he basically wanted to make sure that there would be no king that was as great as he was, including his own family. Well, remember, he killed 2 of his sons. So 2 of his sons didn't even survive. Sorry, I'm plugging this back in. But of the 4 sons that survived, he divided up his kingdom, and he basically made sure none of them had enough strength. They fought amongst themselves. They went to the Romans and would ask for help against each other. And the Romans were able to just increase their power over the territory more because of Herod's dysfunction. I mean, Herod was able in his own lifetime, because he ruled for 40 years and was so able. I mean, he was insane, but he was very able. Again, when you're a dictator who's actually efficient, you can do a lot. Of course, everybody hates you, wants to kill you, but he was able to do that. And the Romans kind of tolerated and maybe in some cases encouraged some of what he did. But when he died, nobody was able to be the kind of dictator that he was. So it only took 30 years for the whole thing to collapse. So, or 40 years for the system to collapse. And as his sons governed, the Romans just took more and more, the Roman governors, the procurators of Rome, just took more and more power, and there was nobody to challenge them. As a matter of fact, the people, the most Israelites, most Judeans, I wouldn't call them Israelites, most Jews were happy to have the Romans come in because and take more power, because the Herodian kings were so dysfunctional and so inept. And quite frankly, they were scared of King Herod. They weren't scared of the kids, which is why when we read in the Christian Bible how Jesus gets sent to Herod, one of the Herods, he doesn't care. He can't do anything, and he doesn't even do anything. He's like, this ain't my problem. So if you watch Jesus Christ Superstar, it's kind of a funny character, because he's like a drug-addled, hippie, not hippie, like a rich hippie, and he just doesn't really know what to do. And that's probably not too far away from what the different Herods, his sons were like. So, and these were even in some cases his grandsons. Some of them were probably nice, tried to be nice kings, better kings, but there was no fear of them, and the Romans definitely didn't have any respect for them. So you don't ever hear about them. I mean, I have coins from they made coins, so they were like, we know that they really were, they lived and they had some power, but they didn't really have much. They didn't really have much control. And so, in some cases, the rabbis, even the early rabbis, liked some of them because they were more respectful than their fathers were, but they were not. They didn't have any real power, so they're more of a historical footnote. So let's read these last chapters of Matot Masei. We're going to go to we'll go to this chapter. So these last couple chapters you're going to see are interesting from the standpoint of really being a triptych, a travel log. Let's read it. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Instruct the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you as portion, the land of Canaan with its various boundaries. Your southern sector shall extend from the wilderness of Zin alongside Edom. Your southern boundary shall start from the tip of the Dead Sea, and your boundary shall turn past the ascent of Akrabim and continue to Zin, with its limits the south of Kadesh Barnea, reaching Hazar Adar, continuing to Asmon. From Asmon, the boundary shall turn to the Wadi of Egypt and terminate at the sea. For the western boundary, you shall have the coast of the Great Sea, the Mediterranean. That shall serve as your western boundary. This shall be your northern boundary. Draw a line from the Great Sea to Mount Hor. From Mount Hor, draw a line to Lebo Hamat, and let that boundary reach Zadad. The boundary shall then run to Ziphron and terminate at Hazar Enan. That shall be your northern boundary. Your eastern boundary, you shall draw a line from Hazar Enan to Shepham." Let me just do one thing. Hold on one second. I'm going to put this up right now, so you can see. And then, of course, the questions are going to be, did Israel ever actually have this? And I will show it to you. Well, actually, let me finish it before I show it to you. From Shepham, the boundary shall descend to Riblah on the east side of Ain. From there, the boundary shall continue downward and abut on the eastern slopes of the Sea of Kinneret. The boundary shall then descend along the Jordan and terminate at the Dead Sea. That shall be your land, is defined by the boundaries on all sides. So let us share what that would have looked like. So this is the map of, if you look at the red boundary, this is what the boundary of Israel looks like, according to Numbers chapter 34. So because he says draw a line, let me just see if I can get, yeah, there we go. You can see that the lines end up coming across straight. They probably weren't exactly as straight as they look like here. But if you look at the red line, that is this is all Syria today. You can see where Damascus is. This is all Syria today, and you see this yellow area right here. Everybody sees the yellow area. You know what that is, right? Everybody? Lebanon.
Oh, Lebanon, yeah.
That's Lebanon. So to understand, the only part of Lebanon that would not have been part of biblical Israel, at least according to Numbers 34. And as you can see, the blue line is the way that the borders are given in Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, which is different but close. And Ezekiel lived 800 years, not 800 years later, 600 years about later is Ezekiel. So we're talking about, this is 1200. He lives about 600, 580s, the 580s, around the time of the destruction of the temple, the exile, if you will. So if you look at the boundary, basically this is the only part of Lebanon that would be not part of Israel according to this boundary. Much of Syria, or parts of Syria, not much of, but parts of Syria would be part of it. The Jordan River makes a good border. You can see the land of Gilad. This is the land that we just took, which is not, and this color is all Jordan. This isn't the land of Gilad, all of it. It's really, like I said, just this area right here to the Jordan to about here. So it's not this, all of this. This is Jordan. The modern countries are colored behind it. Okay? But what I really want to show you, so this border makes sense. This is still the border of Israel, right, to the Dead Sea. What's interesting here is that this little area down here, which is part of modern Israel, was not part of the boundary of Israel. So the southern area of Israel here was not part of the boundary of Israel in the book of Numbers. So technically this area, which includes a lot down here, wasn't part of Israel in Numbers. By the time of King David, David controlled all the way out to here and out to here. David had all of Ammon and Edom and Moab were all part of his kingdom all the way down to here. So David and Solomon, we read about the ships that he set sail out of on the Red Sea out of Eilat. So that was part of his territory. As you can see, the river of Egypt, the Wadi of Egypt, is right here, which would pretty much be pretty close to where the southern border of Israel is today with Egypt, but of course includes Gaza. It includes the heartland of Israel, which is the West Bank. And then this area here, which is Lebanon, all the way along the coast. This area right here was very much a part of the land of Israel, according to the book of Numbers. This area of Lebanon never was under Jewish control. The Phoenicians always maintained control on this area, and quite frankly, the Philistines, through much of Israel's history, maintained this area. Eventually, King David and King Solomon are able to rout the Philistines and make them, even if they were not driven out their subject nations or subject towns, because they didn't really run as a country. They ran as city states. And as Greek Aegean people, it kind of makes sense. They were more Greek, the Philistines. That this area was under David and Solomon's control, but was not, again, the main part of his area. The main part, the heartland of Israel, was this area right here, which again, a good chunk of it today is the Judea, we call Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank. It's this area right here, which is in the color here, this gray color, which is Palestinian. And of course, many Jews live in this area, around this area, a little bit below, some of it's below Jerusalem, but much of it is the north area just above Jerusalem. So you can see Jerusalem, for 5-10 miles on both sides of it, and then north and south, is all Palestinian, would be Palestinian territory. So that's important to think about in the modern nation of Israel. So this is a good map for it. And again, to look at where it was during King Herod's time. King Herod actually controlled less of the coast than this map even shows. This area was under Roman control. Herod didn't even control this area. This was under Phoenician, and then later on Greco-Roman control. The Romans controlled the ports and the land in here. It was not under Herod's. Herod's control started about here and went all the way up to here and went around to here for a time. So the maps changed a lot. This area was always the heartland of Israel. So that's a little geography. I know it's a lot, but this map gives you a good overlay of what Israel looked like for us in that period, and what it, when we talk about the lands today and what makes up a country in the Middle East, as we know, most of those were drawn up by the British and French in the aftermath of World War I, when they decided, the Sykes-Picot.
It's all made up.
Yeah, it was all made up. So you don't, some of it was given to the Christians, Lebanon, because the French, were connected to them and wanted to make sure they had a country. And, look, these are, unfortunately, again, we're still dealing with it now 100 years later. People are dying because of the fact that these were arbitrary, and in some cases, the British repaying debts to, one Bedouin family over another. Why the Hashemites, why King today, the King Abdullah and King, going through King Hussein and his family. I mean, that was a debt that the British owed to his family for supporting them against the Turks. So a lot of this is not ancient history. It's history that goes back to Lawrence of Arabia and 100 years ago, to British and French bureaucrats who in some cases never stepped foot in the land. Honestly, some of them never even went to visit, and they made these decisions. So let's look at, so this is the boundary, right? And then it says, Moses instructed the Israelites, saying, this is the land you are received by lot as a hereditary portion, which the Lord has commanded to be given to you, the other 9.5 tribes. For the Reubenite tribe by its ancestral house, the Gadites by their house, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they've gotten their portion. Those 2.5 tribes have received their portions on the other side of Jericho, on the other side of the Jordan River. On the Orient side, which is a translation of the word Mizracha, on the east, in the Mizrach, on the Orient side, which are words that we use actually today for the Mizrach, for facing towards Jerusalem. We call that Mizrach, facing that way.
A lot of people have their last name Mizracha.
Yeah. So this is, and we call those Jews actually Mizrahi Jews, the Jews from the we don't call them Oriental Jews, but this is obviously translation. Some people, they used to be called, now we call them Eastern Jews or Middle Eastern Jews, or Jews. Sometimes people call them Jews from Arab lands to remind them that they lost everything when the Arabs threw them out after Israel's independence. So those Mizrahi Jews are very important in Israel, and are hopefully going to continue to lead, and they have not. There's yet to be a Mizrahi prime minister. It's a bone of contention amongst Mizrahi Jews, Jews from Syria or Iraq, and Egypt and Morocco. But hopefully one day there will be a better representation for the Mizrahi Jews as well in politics. They're definitely represented by political parties like Shas party, and Likud is definitely the party of Netanyahu has always had a strong showing of Mizrahi, and they've always been important in his cabinet, but there's yet to be a prime minister, a Mizrahi prime minister. So you shall take a chieftain from each tribe of whom the land shall be a portion. These are the names of the men from the tribe. And again, we've had lists of these people before, but there are new generations and new leaders. Judah has Caleb. He's a hero because he's the last man standing. He's the last guy. Him and Joshua are the last men from the old generation. From the tribe of Shimon, Samuel, son of Amihud. From the tribe of Benjamin, Eladad, and son of Chizlon. From the tribe of Dan, Buki, the son of Yogli. From the tribe of Joseph, well, again, he had two sons. So Manasseh, the chieftain was Haniel, the son of Ephod. From the Ephraimite tribe, chieftain Kemuel, the son of Shiftan. From the Zebulunite tribe, a chieftain Elzaphan, the son of Parnach. From the Issachar, the chieftain Paltiel, the son of Azan. From Asher, the chieftain Ahihud, the son of Shelomi. From the Naphtali's chieftain Pedahel, son of Amihud. It was these whom the Lord designated to allot portions to the Israelites in the land of Canaan. So those are the leaders for the next step. And so here we come to the last two chapters. As we finish up tonight with these portions, let's see what happens with the allotment, if you will. So the Lord spoke to Moses in the steppes of Moab. And remember, this is the last chapters. These are the last chapters that are narrations that are not, remember, all of Deuteronomy is Moses speaking to the people. The whole chapter, the whole book is him saying, this is my take of it. Up until now, there's kind of, according to tradition, it's his, it's his writing of it, but it's not his story, if you will. Deuteronomy is his story, and we'll talk about that next week when we read the book of Deuteronomy. What does it mean to have Moses's versions of these events? Let's read his the text before it's his text, before he takes over. So here we go. Instruct the Israelite people to assign out of the holdings a portion to them. Towns for the Levites. Oh, here we go. Towns for the Levites to the dwell in. For you shall assign to the Levites pasture land around the town. So they have to have pasture land for the animals that they're taking care of, that they're getting in line for sacrificing. It's their refrigerator, if you will. The town shall be theirs to dwell in, and the pasture shall be for their cattle they own and the other beasts. The town pasture that you two are to assign to the Levites shall extend 1,000 cubits outside the wall or all around the town, all around. You shall measure off 2,000 cubits outside the town on the east side, 2,000 on the south side, 2,000 on the west side, and 2,000 on the north side, with the town in its center. That shall be the pasture for their towns. The towns that you shall assign to the Levites shall comprise the 6 cities of refuge that you are to designate for the manslayer to flee to which you to add 42 towns. Thus, the total of the towns that you shall assign to the Levites shall be 48 towns with them to pasture, for them to pasture. So again, they have 42 towns, and they are also in charge of the cities of refuge, which are the cities that people who commit not murder, but manslaughter, they're allowed to go to those towns to not be killed. If they step out of those towns, they can be killed with an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for life. But if they stay in those towns, they don't leave those towns, they can live in those towns. It's essentially like being in prison, but being punished for killing somebody. Let's say you rode your cart over them and it was your fault, but you didn't do it intentionally. It wasn't murder. We don't have jails. And so this is the equivalent. You lost some freedom. It's not a prison, but it's also tough. It's a tough punishment. And the Levites are in charge of those towns. In assigning the towns from the holding of the Levites, take from the larger groups and from less from the smaller, so that each assigns towns to the Levites in proportion to the shares that it receives. So again, bigger tribes are going to have more cities that are Levite cities. The Lord spoke further to Moses, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, you shall provide yourselves with places to serve, your cities of refuge, which a manslayer who's killed a person unintentionally may flee. The city shall serve as a refuge from the avenger, so that the manslayer may not die unless he stood trial before the assembly. The towns that you shall assign shall be 6 cities and refuge in all. 3 cities shall be designated beyond the Jordan, and the other 3 shall be designated in the land of Canaan. They shall serve as cities of refuge. So 3 of those towns are now going to be in the areas of the Gadites and Reubenites, which percentage-wise is a lot. And even though, it's a decent-sized piece of land, it's almost like saying, you know what, we're going to put more of percentage-wise, proportionally, we're going to put more with them because, again, these are not towns or areas we were necessarily supposed to have. So it's a bonus, and they're going to have those cities amongst them. These cities shall serve as the Israelites and the resident alien among them for refuge, so that anyone who kills a person unintentionally may flee there. And again, this is a whole different idea to some extent. It's put here in terms of the areas that you're going to capture and take, because again, you need to know from the outset that there are rules for the places that you come to, and that it's not a free-for-all, and that there are even things that are going to be put into terms of protecting your society with this setup. And again, to some extent, it's what the founding fathers of our country tried to do, and in some cases didn't do a very good job of doing, because we don't talk about it, but we had a period of time where we were under the Articles of Confederation, that was like people couldn't figure out what to do. They didn't know what to do because they hadn't really done a good job of defining what infrastructure there would be for a unified government. Well, now you have something, the cities of refuge. So it's an interesting kind of infrastructure project, if you will, that is there even before they take hold of the land. So keep that in mind, that this is, we're not spending as much time on it right now, but the cities of refuge is an interesting thing to reflect on. As I said, there are people who do whole Divrei Torah on this section. And I will tell you that a few years ago, actually now I'm looking at it, it was 17 years ago, David Mamet, the great playwright, screenwriter as well, David Mamet wrote a commentary on the Torah. You may not know that. He wrote a book called Cities of Refuge, which are reflections on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These were reflections on things he wanted to write about. He wrote them with Rabbi Lawrence Kushner as a co-writer. But again, you didn't know. Glenn Ross also wrote some Torah commentary. It's been a while since I looked at it, but there was some good stuff in there. He's a great writer. It shows you he takes the Torah pretty seriously. At least in the last 20 years or so of his life, he's definitely taking the Torah pretty serious. So he called it, by the way, the 5 cities of refuge, because he kind of like played off the 6 cities of refuge, the 5 cities being the 5 books of the Torah. All right. Anyone, however, who strikes another person with an iron object so that the death results as a murderer, that murderer must be put to death. So it's a reminder that there's a death penalty for murder. Cities of refuge don't reflect this, don't apply to murderers. If he struck him with a stone tool that caused death and death resulted, he's a murderer. So it's not just iron, It's also stone. Similarly, if the object with which he struck him was a wooden tool, that he could cause his death, and death resulted, he's a murderer. That murderer must be put to death.
But
What?
is
Yeah.
it true that you're supposed to have two witnesses to the murder for a Jewish court?
Yeah, we can also talk about the death penalty, and there are many places where the death penalty is prescribed in the Torah. As we know, the Talmud makes it virtually impossible to have the death penalty. Didn't mean they didn't punish people. They would flog them and fine them and exile them and what's the word? Excommunicate was the word I was looking for. There were a lot of penalties that came about because the rabbis were very hesitant to put people to death. But we can imagine that there was a time, especially in the early days of Israel, during the times of Abraham and Isaac and patriarchal times, when people were a little less cosmopolitan, if you will, and there really was nothing you could do other than kill the person. And again, by the time the rabbis were living in cities, most of them were not farmer. I mean, if they were a farmer, they lived in a city. The punishments were a little bit more complicated, and they really tried to not do it. But these, again, they're saying you don't have to stab somebody. You could beat them over the head. You could hit them with a hammer, with a wood, the wood or stone tool. You don't have to kill them with a knife. They're a murderer. But it says the blood avenger himself shall put the murderer to death. It is he who shall put him to death upon encounter. So again, the family had to actually do it. So too, if he pushed him in hate or hurled something at him on purpose and death resulted, or if he struck him with his hand in enmity and death resulted, the assailant shall be put to death. He's a murderer. So again, even if he used his own body, if his hands were weapons, what does they say? What is that line? My hands are registered weapons or something. Then you could also be put to death if you were a kung fu master. The blood avenger shall put the murderer to death upon encounter. But if he pushed him without malice aforethought, or hurled any object at him unintentionally, or inadvertently dropped upon him any object of stone, and death resulted, though he was not an enemy of his and did not seek him harm, in such cases the assembly shall decide between the slayer and the blood avenger. The assembly shall protect the manslayer from the blood avenger, and the assembly shall restore him to the city of refuge to which he fled, and there he shall remain until death of the high priest who is anointed with the sacred oil. So there was a time limit for how long you were in a city of refuge. When the high priest died, you could go free. So you can imagine that some of these guys in the towns were waiting for this thing, but there's a little bit here about this though. But if the manslayer ever goes outside the limits of the city of refuge to which he has fled, and the blood avenger comes upon him outside the limits of city of refuge, and the blood avenger kills the manslayer, there is no blood guilt on his account. For he must remain inside the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. After the death of the high priest, the manslayer may return to his landholding. Such shall be your law of procedure throughout the ages in all your settlements. If anyone kills a person, the manslayer may be executed only on the evidence of witnesses. So here it says specifically what the witnesses are. The testimony of a single witness against the person shall not suffice for a sentence of death.
Two people. That's right.
Yeah, and the Talmud goes even further, which is that you have to have witnesses that can attest to the validity and to the accuracy and to the veracity and to the overall veracity of the witness. So if the witness did not have a good reputation, you didn't take his word for it. So the rabbis made it, and then they said you had to have witnesses on the witnesses. So 3 layers of witnesses. So they made it virtually impossible for a witness even to come forward and say, or I should say witnesses to come forward. They made it virtually impossible. So much so that there's a famous line in the Talmud that Rabbi Akiva said that a court that kills somebody even once every 70 years is considered a hanging court, is a bloodthirsty or execute, is an overly violent or vengeful court. So they did not, basically by the Talmudic period, kill many people in capital for capital murder, they did not execute people. I was going to say kill them, but execute them. Made it virtually impossible, the rabbis. You may not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of a capital crime. He must be put to death. So you can't have him give somebody else over and say, oh, here's somebody you can take for me. No. Nor may you accept a ransom in lieu of a flight to a city of refuge, enabling one to return to live on his land before the death of the priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land, and the land can have no expiation for blood that is shed on it, except by the blood of him who shed it. So again, there is a desire not to have people get away with crime. And I would say this is a Jewish value to this day. We are a people who, almost more than anything else, we don't want vengeance, we want justice. And I will tell you, this is a characteristic that I've seen among Jews of all political affiliations and all stripes and all backgrounds. And this sense of having justice is something that I think is one of the characteristics, one of the underlying values of the Jewish people. And again, it's not about vengeance, it's about justice. And then it carries over to make sure that the people who are victims of crimes are brought to bear, and that we see, and even when it's our own people. I mean, I know a lot of people that wanted to see Jeffrey Epstein brought to justice, including myself. There are a lot of people that want to see Harvey Weinstein brought to justice, or Bernard Madoff. There were Jews that we wanted to see be brought to justice. But on the other hand, again, it goes to say that, there are other people that we wanted to see brought to justice, whether it was O.J. Simpson or there's a whole litany of people that we wanted to see be brought to justice. And it hurts us when we see it not happen. And I won't go into all of them because, again, everybody has their ones that touch them. The O.J. one was the one that touched me the most, which is why when Ron Goldman's sister, Kim, moved out to Santa Clarita, I said, I can't do anything for how our country let you down, but you're going to be a member of the temple, and your son is going to have a bar mitzvah here, and you're never going to have to pay for it. And it's a promise that we fulfilled. And Sam had his bar mitzvah 3 years ago at our temple, and again, does nothing to take away from the loss and the lack of justice that she had in this country, and the embarrassment I have almost every time I see her, when I can't even look at her sometimes because I'm still embarrassed about how this country let her down. But at the same time, we try to do something. And I guess that sense of justice that we have is one that's real for us. And I talked to her last week. I let her know that 4 weeks ago, on the 12th, I think it was, of June, it was her brother's yard site. And we've been saying Kaddish for him for, it's hard to believe, for over 25 years now, that this has been a stain on our country. And when we talk about the land that we live in being polluted by blood, it's why when we saw, George Floyd being murdered, we were upset by it. We Jewish community was not happy to have people get away with crimes, a month ago. So with that being said, you shall not defile the land with which you live, for I myself abide, in which I myself abide. I live there. I'm with you there, God says. I, the Lord, abide among my people, the Israelite people. So it's a beautiful idea. Let's finish up the last chapter, folks, in this last 6 minutes. And if you think I'm going to run through it fast, I am, because you know what? This is the triptych. The family, the heads of the clans, the descendants of Gilad, the son of Machir, son of Manasseh, one of the Josephite clans, came forward and appealed to Joseph, except for this part, which I'm not going to get into because it's my Divrei Torah, which I'm posting tomorrow or tonight. It's what I'm talking about. And I mentioned it last week. The daughters of Tzlofchad. They said, the Lord commanded my Lord to assign the land of Israelites as shares by lot, and my Lord was further commanded by the Lord to assign to our kinsman Tzlofchad to his daughters. Now, if they marry persons and from another Israelite tribe, their shall be cut off from our ancestral portion and be added to the portion of the tribe into which they marry. Thus our allotted portion will be diminished. And even when the Israelites observe the Jubilee, their share will be added to that of the tribe in which they marry, and their share shall be cut off from the ancestral portion of our tribe. So Moses, at the Lord's bidding, instructed the Israelites, saying, so God says this, some Moses, the plea of the Josephite tribe is just. This is what the Lord has commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. They may marry anyone they wish, provided they marry into the clan of their father's tribe. No inheritance of the Israelites may pass from one tribe to another, but the Israelites must remain bound each to their ancestral portion of his tribe. Every daughter among the Israelite tribe who inherits a share, like the daughters of Zelophehad, so if it happens to the Danites or the Reubenites or anybody else, note, they have to marry within their tribe if they're the ones who inherit, in order that every Israelite may keep his ancestral shares. So this is the corollary. We had a law, the daughters of Zelophehad get to inherit their father's portion because they don't have brothers, but it has to stay within the tribe. It makes sense. You can't have it leave. So we have a corollary to a case law. So the case law comes up and then, yeah, but what about this? And so thus no inheritance shall pass from one tribe to another, but the Israelite tribe shall remain bound to each portion. The daughters of Zelophehad did as the Lord had commanded Moses. Machla, Tirzah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Noah. Zelophehad's daughters were married to the sons of their uncles, married into the clans of the descendants of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. So their share remained in the tribe of their father's clan. So it stayed within the tribe of Manasseh. Thus the Israelites, these are the commandments of the Israelites and the regulations of the Lord enjoined upon the Israelites through Moses on the steps of Moab at the Jordan near Jericho. So, folks, we made it through, and we made it through in just amount of time. But of course, when we finish the book of the Torah, we have to say, Chazak, Chazak, Venit Chazek. Be strong, let all of us be strengthened. And by the way, now more than ever, we need to say, hopefully everyone will stay healthy and stay strong as we fight illness, and we hope that everybody protects themselves and protects others, and that you take the inner strength and the physical strength and use them together to combine to stay healthy and to stay powerful. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Be strong and be strong. Let all of us be strengthened. And again, the story of the narrative, our time comes to an end with the journey of the Israelites. The Bamidbar, the journey through the wilderness, has come to an end. They're going to make that final jump without Moses, with Joshua leading them, and we read about it only at the very end of the book of Deuteronomy. So just like in Leviticus, there's no movement. The book of Numbers, there is no movement. This is the end of the move. This is the end of narrative, if you will, as the story unfolds, as it's recounted in real time, if you will, because Moses is going to step back and count back and go back to his memories of 40 years and then move forward and take people up to the present. But he doesn't move them at all. They don't. The story moves them. The recounting, if you will, the memories move them emotionally, but not physically. So again, we also say when we finish books in general, we say Tom v'neshalem tehillah el borei olam. Let's give thanks to God, the creator of everything. Folks, I will be talking more about the daughters of Zelophehad in my Devar Torah, so I won't get into it now, but I do think it's another example. We read about Zelophehad, we read about the Midianite women, and we read at the very beginning about women taking oaths. We can see that the Bible is trying to carve out a place for women, which will, again, be a statement of its time, but at the same time, put us into a whole nother level of where women and what women can do, and can do, because again, it says the daughters of Zelophehad could choose who they could marry, which even in today's world, there are places where women can't choose who they can marry. I mean, it's a restriction that they have to marry within their tribe, but that makes sense because they've inherited, right? They've inherited and they can't take the property outside. But I will tell you, this is an example of the Torah's protection and considerations for the role that women must play in society. And I will tell you that I believe that still it animates us today as people who always are trying to figure out how to make sure women are afforded rights and a say and leadership in our world, in our community. And so I think most Jews are not going to have any issue with whatever party or whatever leader in our country, and we're one of the few industrialized nations that have not been led by women, that one day when there is a woman president of our country, I think you're going to find Jews might even cross party lines to vote for that woman, because we know that it's time that a woman also takes on the role of leadership in our country. And I think most people would say that this is we're beyond due to have a woman leader take on the highest levels of leadership. And as I said before, and as I showed yesterday, because it's still on my desk, one of my favorite women leaders, Margaret Thatcher, right there with me 25 years ago, right? I said, or almost 30 years ago, the Iron Lady with me and my grandma. Yeah, England's had a woman prime minister decades before we did now. So we of course talk about Golda Meir being prime minister literally 50 years ago in Israel. And we're not talking, I used to say it was 20 or 30 years ago. Now it gets to be ridiculous that Israel had a female prime minister 50 years before America has a woman president. So with that, again, thank you, women, for being there tonight on our line. Thank you, women, some of you who celebrated your B'nai Mitzvah with us a few weeks ago. We're still, again, looking at that as one of the highlights of our COVID period, that you were bold enough and strong enough to give us inspiration during this time and inhabit our building, if you will. So thank you, women, for inspiring us and leading us. And coming up next week is your Rosh Chodesh, which is your holiday. You get the day off on Rosh Chodesh. It is the women's holiday. So you know that, right? You women, you're supposed to get the day off on Rosh Chodesh. So, all right. Everybody's been muted all night, but I didn't want people I wanted people to unmute themselves as they had stuff to say. But please, again, stay healthy, everybody. I want to leave with that. And we'll see you Friday night with services, or with Tuesday morning, next Tuesday, or more importantly, again, to stay healthy, or join us for bingo on Sunday night. Don't forget bingo, our second session in this new, not too late to join and get a bingo card too. So that's been a lot of fun. Everybody stay healthy, and gosh, I can't say it enough. Please, nobody get sick. Take care, everybody.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.